Vivek Debrois.
Thank you, Shakti and Anirban. An apology and a correction. The correction is it's not my book. I and Ashok Malik happen to be only the editors. And Ashok is a dear friend. If Ashok is absent, I cannot really be present, which brings me to the apology. I have to leave at about 11. As I just said, this is edited by Ashok and me. It's a collection of papers. And 5 of the authors are present here. So hopefully, after the break, there will be a discussion about the issues that they are going to talk about. Why this book? Ever since this government was formed in May 2014, and even before that, when there were expectations that Mr. Modi might be the next Prime Minister, a lot of books started to surface. A lot of books started to surface on Mr. Modi as an individual, on what Modi-nomics represented. Most of those books are not very, very good. The only exceptions that I can think of pre-May 2014 and even post-May 2014 are in the area of foreign policy. Foreign policy and or security. If you take away foreign policy and or security, I cannot really think of any good books that document what this government intends to do, what this government has done, and what this government plans to do in the future. And therefore, Shakti, Anirban, Ashok, and Shobit, the publisher who's sitting there, we sat down and, so to speak, plotted this book, consciously trying to identify authors who would pick specific areas and describe exactly what I have said. To some extent we were successful, to some extent we were not. For example, you will not find any glaring commissions. You will not look at any of the papers and say, why on earth is this paper here? But you will look at that list of papers and you will think of several areas that should have been covered but have not been covered. Important areas: agriculture and or rural development, employment, skills, perhaps even demonetization. Well, the reason those were not covered is not that we wanted to duck those areas, but simply that we could not find authors who would write and would write fast enough. So if any one of you is going to volunteer, please get in touch with any of us. Because we do plan, Shakti and Anirban permitting, an expanded version of this book, updated and or expanded version of this book in 2018. We more or less promised it to the Prime Minister. Now let's turn to the government. And let me bring to your notice, I'm not describing what is in the book, otherwise you won't read the book, bad for the publisher. I want to bring to your notice 2 recent developments, both of which are ostensibly very, very minor and innocuous. The first one concerns the railways. A decision was taken that general managers will not have to turn up at airports and railway stations to receive members of the railway board and the chairman of the railway board. A decision was taken that the railways possesses printing presses. A decision was taken that these printing presses would be closed down because they weren't doing anything particularly productive. A decision was taken that railway officers, senior level railway officers, would no longer use saloons. Ostensibly, very minor, trivial changes. But note, these are changes that should have been done many, many years ago. People talked about them, people mentioned them. Were those changes ever implemented? The answer is no. Let me turn to the second news item, which is about an organization known as DGSND, which has been responsible for government procuring things. And in the process of procurement, reportedly, there was a lot of corruption. There is now a portal known as the GEM portal, through which transparently one can procure. And I'm not getting into figures on how much savings there have been because the GEM portal is relatively new still. However, once the GEM portal took off, DGSND has been scrapped. Why have I started with these two ostensibly very, very minor instances? The reason is this, that when this government was formed in May 2014, a lot of people had expectations about what this government should do. The expectations that people had were not necessarily promises made either by the Prime Minister or by the government or by anyone else. To the best of my knowledge, the Prime Minister has never said, this is what we will accomplish in the first 100 days. This is what we will accomplish in the first 365 days. These were all expectations on the part of people who viewed this government with a certain prism. So they said, we expect this government to spend on the social sectors, we expect this government to spend on health. Maybe yes, maybe no. But quite oblivious of the fact that there is an Indian constitution, there is a 7th schedule to the Indian constitution, and the 7th schedule to the Indian constitution sets out a union list, a concurrent list, and a state list. And health is squarely in the state list. With the exception of the Medical Council of India, there is absolutely nothing that pertains to the union government's list. So if I strictly go by the letter of the constitution, the only way the union government can directly increase expenditure on health is by spending more on the Medical Council of India, which I presume none of us wants. Similarly, people came along and said there were problems with the land legislation. So why does this government not change the land legislation? Fair enough. But these people should also be aware that land is squarely in the state list. So they should have asked in the year 2013, why was the union government legislating on an area that was squarely in the state list? There was a slight amount of subterfuge that was done in terms of the transfer of property clause, but forget that. Fundamentally, land is in the state list. Similarly, labor. Labor also happens to be on the concurrent list. So the first point I want to make is that the expectations and gauging what this government has done and what this government has not done should be in terms of what the government's own agenda is And this is a government that is fundamentally, as per the Constitution, an executive arm. An executive arm of the government cannot scrap legislature, even if that were to be desired. It cannot scrap the judiciary, even if that were to be desired. In the constitutional structure, expectations on the part of this government have to be defined in terms of the checks and balances that are there in the Constitution. To my mind, the most important plank of governance and development, and I'm deliberately staying away from foreign policy because there are others who have authored on foreign policy. They will speak about foreign policy and security. On the domestic side, I think the most important plank of governance of this particular government is one of institutional change. And let me give you some examples to illustrate what I mean by this institutional change. For years and years, people have argued that India is excessively centralized. India was centralized under the British for colonial reasons. India continued to be centralized post 1947 because of planning reasons. India was excessively centralized even in comparison with formally centrally planned economies. Sachin, should I use the word formally? I think I should, like China. So there was an issue of decentralization and devolution. So the first point I want to flag in this connection is the recommendations of the 14th Finance Commission. What did the 14th Finance Commission say? The 14th Finance Commission said that the share of the states in the divisible pool untied so far as the union government is concerned, because what happens to that expenditure is determined by the states. The share of the states in that divisible pool will increase from the base of 32% to 42%. That 10% increase is an unprecedented increase. Do you think it was very easy for the union government to agree to this increase, given the pay commission, given OROP, given the compulsion to reduce the fiscal deficit, given the compulsion to spend on railways, national highways, and this, that, and the other? It wasn't easy. It would have been very, very tempting for the union government to say that we are unable to increase it from 32% to 42% at one go. We will increase it from 32% to 37% by 5% and take the remaining 5% later. Instead, it was agreed that there would be an increase from 32% to 42%. Over and above this, the union government used to fund what are known as central sector and centrally sponsored schemes. Who devised the templates of these central sector and centrally sponsored schemes? The predecessor organization to Niti Aayog, Planning Commission. So a few wise men and women sitting there in Yojana Bhavan decided what the template should be for these centrally sponsored schemes. And consequently, you had something like the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, which funded rural roads, except that the template for the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana said that he could use that money only to build a road. Sometimes the road requires a bridge. The Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana allowed you to build the roads, but not the bridge. So if you are a relatively cash-rich state like Gujarat, you used your own scheme to build that road, and if you are a relatively cash-starved state like Jharkhand, you build the road without the bridges. It would have been very, very tempting for the PM to ask Niti Aayog to devise the template of these new centrally sponsored schemes. Perhaps even Finance Ministry could have done it. Instead, groups of chief ministers were set up to examine centrally sponsored schemes, skill development, and the Swachh Bharat mission. Every chief minister was a member of one or the other of these groups of chief ministers. Each chief minister except one participated in the deliberations. You'll ask me which one, so I might as well say that was West Bengal. So the template of the central sector centrally sponsored schemes was laid down in stone. It's cast in stone. Earlier chief ministers would come to Planning Commission, ask for discretionary funds. All discretion is gone. Is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? I would argue it's a good thing. If for Group D posts, interviews have been scrapped and the interviews gave rise to a lot of corruption, rent seeking and discretion, if interviews have been scrapped for Group D posts, I would say it's a good thing. If the colonial legacy of the railway budget has been done away with, I would say it's a good thing. That's also part of the institutional mechanism. If there is talk of changing the financial year, that also I would say is a good thing. At least there's a talk. I'm not getting into the pros and cons of it. If there is talk of changing the system of electoral funding, at least we've got that on the discourse. I'm not getting into a debate about how useful electoral bonds will be or will not be. At least we've got a debate going on the merits or otherwise of electoral funding, conducting elections, simultaneous elections, all of that. All of that represents the institutional change of which one part is decentralization and fiscal devolution, but not the only part. All of us as citizens have become very, very lazy. We abdicate our responsibility. A country does not change because governments decide to change the country. Governments, union government, state government, local government, they are relatively powerless. A country changes only when we as citizens participate in that process of change, participate in governance, and that is what distinguishes governance from government. I will give you 3 examples. The first example is the Smart City Mission. What distinguishes the Smart City Mission from something like the JNNURM? Several things. One thing that distinguishes the Smart City Mission from the JNNURM is the citizens of the city decide in consultation with municipal governments, in consultation with even the state government, what the smartness template will be for that particular city. So if you look at the top 2 cities in the rankings, Bhubaneswar and Pune, you will see the citizens of Bhubaneswar have interpreted smartness in one particular way, the citizens of Pune have interpreted it in one other possible way. The Swachh Bharat mission, I think, is also an example of that, of getting the citizens involved. Even demonetization, I think, had a large element of that moral argument. By the way, while on demonetization, demonetization wasn't only about what happened on the 8th of November 2016. Before demonetization, there were other elements that had already happened. There was a great increase in the number of people with Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan accounts. Yes, the attempt had started earlier, but the explosion is such that today, not government figures, independent figures show that 99% of households in India, even rural households, even poor households, have bank accounts. So the debate of financial inclusion has moved away from getting people to open bank accounts to encouraging them to use those bank accounts by developing various kinds of products. Even before 8th of November 2016, there had been the real estate legislation. There had been the second voluntary declaration of income scheme. All of these, as I said, are attempts to institutionally clean up. I will quickly mention, since I have mentioned the Jan Dhan accounts, I will quickly mention Aadhaar, not as a card but as a biometry, and it being linked increasingly to the Jan Dhan accounts, it being linked to mobiles and also to direct benefit transfers. On direct benefit transfers, I will ask you to read something. This is the President's address to Parliament in June 2004. In June 2004, mark the year, June 2004, you will find, if my memory serves me right, a paragraph 38. That paragraph 38 set out what the then government, namely UPA 1, would accomplish in the first 100 days. And in that list, it said, identification of the poor can only be done through decentralized identification through Gram Sabhas on the rural side. Promised in the first 100 days. Was it implemented in the first 100 days? No. Was it implemented during the tenure of either UPA 1 or UPA 2? The answer is no. But this is precisely what has been implemented through the SECC rule and is now being interpreted through is being used through the SECC urban, which has been integrated with SECC rural, linked with what has now come to be called the JAM Trinity, the Jan Dhan, the Aadhaar, the mobiles. From what I have just described, you will gather that the agenda is not something that can be completed in 100 days, 3.5 years, 5 years, even 10 years. What one is demolishing is an edifice that has been built up over more than 7 decades, perhaps even longer. So therefore, scrutiny is desirable, criticism is desirable, but what is being attempted is something that will change India only in the long haul. I apologize once again because I have to go, and thank you.